The summer heat hung heavy over Brooklyn, the kind of oppressive warmth that made the sidewalks shimmer and the air itself feel like it was pressing down on your chest. It was a late afternoon in Brownsville, the neighborhood buzzing with the usual sounds, kids bouncing basketballs against cracked pavement, radios blasting soul music from open windows, and the occasional rumble of the subway tracks above. Gloria Tyson walked home slowly from the corner store, her paper bag of groceries tucked firmly against her hip. She was tired from the day but steady as always, her strength evident in every step. Gloria wasn't a woman to be intimidated. She had endured poverty, discrimination, and hardship that would have broken weaker spirits. But that day she was about to face something far more dangerous than an empty wallet or a late rent notice. At the corner of Amboy Street, a police cruiser idled with its engine running. Behind the wheel sat Officer Raymond Doyle, a broad-shouldered white cop with a buzz cut and a reputation in the neighborhood that made people cross the street to avoid him. Doyle had been on the force long enough to learn exactly how much power came with a badge and how often he could use it without consequence. His eyes narrowed as he spotted Gloria. To him, she wasn't just another woman heading home. In his mind, she was a target. "Hey, you!" Doyle barked, stepping out of the cruiser. His voice cut through the air like a whip. "What are you doing out here?" Gloria stopped, tightening her grip on her groceries. She turned slowly, her face calm but firm. "I'm walking home, officer, from the store," Doyle sneered, taking deliberate steps closer. "Walking home, huh? Looks more like loitering to me. You people always hanging around looking for trouble." The words carried the weight of every insult Gloria had endured in her life. But she didn't flinch. She simply adjusted the bag in her arm and said evenly, "I live 2 blocks down. I'm no trouble to you." That calm defiance, that refusal to shrink, ignited something ugly in Doyle. He reached out, his hand latching onto Gloria's arm with unnecessary force. "Don't walk away when I'm talking to you." Gloria tried to pull back, her voice steady but rising. "Let go of me. You don't have the right." And that's when Doyle did it. With a flash of rage, he shoved the groceries from her arm, sending them tumbling across the sidewalk. Then he grabbed her by the throat. His thick fingers closed around her neck, forcing her back against the brick wall of the corner building. Gasps erupted from the small crowd of neighbors nearby. People froze, staring, shocked, some too afraid to move. This wasn't the first time they'd seen Officer Doyle harass someone in the community, but it was the first time it had escalated so quickly, so violently in broad daylight. Gloria struggled, her breath catching in her throat, her hands clawing at Doyle's grip. Her voice cracked, but her words were clear. "Get off me!" And then came a sound that would cut through the chaos like thunder. "Get your hands off my mother." The voice belonged to a teenager, but there was nothing childlike about the force behind it. From the end of the block, Mike Tyson came charging forward. He was only in his teens then, not yet the heavyweight champion the world would come to know. But his size and intensity already made him stand out. His eyes burned with fury, his fists clenched tight, his whole body moving with explosive power. Doyle barely had time to turn his head before Mike was on him. With a speed that startled everyone watching, Mike's fist shot forward, connecting squarely with Doyle's jaw. The sound of the impact echoed down the street, a sickening crack that sent the officer sprawling backward, his grip on Gloria breaking instantly. Doyle crashed to the ground, stunned and gasping for air. The crowd erupted, some cheering, some screaming, all unable to believe what they had just seen. A teenage boy had just dropped one of the most feared cops in the neighborhood with a single punch. Gloria stumbled forward, coughing, clutching her throat. Mike caught her before she could fall, his arm wrapping around her protectively. His voice was trembling with rage, but steady enough to be heard. "You don't ever touch my mother, not ever." Doyle struggled to rise, his face twisted with humiliation and rage. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. He pointed a shaking finger at Mike, his voice hoarse but venomous. "You're finished, boy. You hear me? Finished." Sirens wailed in the distance backup Doyle had called earlier, or maybe another patrol responding to the commotion. Neighbors began pulling out their phones, whispering, "Did you see that? Mike Tyson just knocked him out cold." Others urged Gloria and Mike to run, but it was too late. Another police cruiser screeched to a halt, and two more officers jumped out, one of them Officer Greg Turner, Doyle's longtime partner. Turner rushed to Doyle's side, helping him up while glaring daggers at Mike. "You're in big trouble, kid," Turner growled. "Real big trouble." Mike's chest heaved, but he stood his ground, his arms still wrapped protectively around his mother. Gloria's voice, though hoarse, broke through the tension. "He was choking me," she rasped. "Your partner was choking me in the street." Turner ignored her, focusing only on Doyle's busted lip and bruised pride. "Assaulting an officer," he spat. "That's a charge you won't walk away from." The crowd grew louder, some shouting in defense of Gloria and Mike, others urging them to lawyer up. The scene was chaos, neighbors yelling, police radios crackling, Gloria clutching her throat, and Mike Tyson standing taller than he ever had, even as a teenager. Because in that moment, the world saw not just a boy defending his mother. They saw the fire of a fighter, one who would never back down, not even against the system itself. The scene on Amboy Street was no longer just another police encounter. It had become an explosion, raw, public, and impossible to ignore. Neighbors poured out of nearby buildings, drawn by the shouting and the unmistakable thud of Doyle's body hitting the ground. Mothers clutching toddlers, teenagers with wide eyes, old men leaning on canes, all of them formed a ring around the confrontation, their whispers rising into shouts. "Did you see what he did to Miss Tyson?" someone cried. "He was choking her," another shouted, and the boy laid him out flat. Phones were raised, shaky hands capturing grainy video that would soon ripple through the neighborhood like wildfire. In Brownsville, stories traveled fast, and this one carried the weight of a legend in the making. Doyle, still dazed, staggered upright with Turner's help. His jaw throbbed, his lips split, his pride shattered in front of dozens of witnesses. But humiliation only made him more dangerous. His eyes locked on Mike with a hatred that could cut through steel. "You're done," Doyle spat, his words dripping with venom. "I'll make sure of it." Mike stood tall, his fists still clenched, his chest heaving with adrenaline. He had never looked more like his future self, the fighter the world would one day fear. But right now, he wasn't a boxer. He was just a boy defending his mother. "She didn't do anything," Mike shot back, his voice trembling with fury. "You put your hands on her for nothing." The crowd roared in agreement, voices overlapping in a chorus of outrage. "She didn't do nothing. We saw the whole thing. That cop went too far." But the sirens were growing louder. Two more cruisers screeched onto the block, lights flashing, tires screeching against the cracked asphalt. Doors slammed, and more officers spilled out, forming a wall of blue between the Tysons and the gathering crowd. Turner barked orders, his face red with fury. "Step back! Everybody step back right now!" But the crowd didn't move. Not this time. They had seen too much. A woman nearly choked in broad daylight, a boy forced to fight for his mother's life, and a cop on the ground, exposed for what he truly was. An elderly man stepped forward, his voice strong despite his years. "I've been living here 40 years. I saw what he did to her. That boy saved his mama's life." One of the younger officers shoved him back roughly. "Get out of the way!" The crowd erupted again, outrage boiling over. People shouted, cursed, raised their phones higher. What might have been just another ugly incident was quickly turning into a spectacle the department couldn't control. Gloria, her throat raw and bruised, clutched Mike's arm. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "Don't say another word, Michael. Don't give them nothing they can use." Mike clenched his jaw, his fury still simmering just beneath the surface. But he listened, because in his mother's voice, even through the pain, was wisdom born from years of surviving in a world stacked against her. Turner leaned in close to Doyle. "We can spin this. You just say the kid attacked you first. We'll make it stick." But Doyle wasn't whispering quietly enough. The words carried, and the crowd gasped. Several people shouted, "We heard that. He's lying already. Don't let them frame that boy." A younger officer shifted nervously, glancing between the angry neighbors and his superior officers. The weight of what was happening pressed on everyone, the realization that this moment wasn't going away. Not this time, not in this neighborhood. Doyle, fueled by rage and humiliation, lurched forward, pointing at Mike. "Arrest him, now!" Two officers stepped toward Mike, cuffs in hand. The crowd erupted again, surging forward, voices thundering in unison. "No, no, we saw it! He didn't do nothing!" For a brief moment, the officers hesitated. Even they could see the fire in the community's eyes. But orders were orders. They grabbed Mike by the arms. He didn't resist, though every muscle in his body screamed for him to fight back. Gloria shouted, her voice cracking. "He saved me! You can't do this!" Turner pushed her aside, not as violently as Doyle, but enough to send a clear message. "Step back, ma'am, or you'll be next." The crowd surged again, shouts of outrage echoing against the buildings. It was chaos, voices, sirens, radios, the sound of struggle. And through it all, young Mike Tyson stood tall, his hands finally restrained in steel cuffs, his head held high despite the weight of injustice pressing down on him. Doyle wiped the blood from his mouth and sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "Congratulations, kid. You just threw your life away." But even in that moment, chained, surrounded, facing a future that suddenly seemed uncertain, Mike Tyson looked at him with eyes that burned hotter than the summer sun. And with a steady voice that carried across the block, he said, "The only life ruined today is yours." The crowd erupted again, not in fear, but in pride, because they knew the truth. They had seen it with their own eyes, and no matter how the system tried to twist it, that truth wasn't going to disappear. As the officers dragged Mike toward the cruiser, neighbors shouted his name, raised their fists, and promised to tell the world what they saw. Gloria stumbled behind, her voice hoarse but unbroken, shouting her son's name as if it were a shield. And in that moment, before the courtrooms, before the lawyers, before the headlines, the legend of Mike Tyson wasn't born in a boxing ring. It was born on a cracked sidewalk in Brooklyn when a boy threw his first true punch, not for glory, but for justice. The squad car door slammed shut with a metallic clang that echoed through Mike Tyson's bones. The cuffs bit into his wrists, cold and unyielding. He sat rigid in the back seat, his fists balled so tightly his knuckles whitened, though he could barely move. His jaw clenched, his breath steady but heavy. Outside, the crowd was still roaring, neighbors shouting, hands pounding against the hood of the police cruiser, voices rising above the sirens. "We saw it! Let him go! He saved his mama! This ain't justice!" But the officers ignored every word. The cruiser lurched forward, cutting through the sea of anger, leaving the sound of protest fading behind. Beside the patrol car, Gloria Tyson stumbled to keep up. Her voice was raw, her throat bruised, but she screamed anyway. "That's my son. He didn't do nothing." Two younger officers blocked her path, their arms stretched wide. "Ma'am, you need to calm down," one barked. Gloria's eyes flashed with fire. "Calm down? After what your partner just did to me." She touched her neck, the red marks stark against her dark skin. "You call this justice? You call this protection?" The officer looked away, shame flickering for just a second before hardening his face again. "You'll have your chance to talk. Not here. Not now." But Gloria knew the truth. In this world, chances weren't handed out. They had to be fought for, tooth and nail. At the precinct, Mike was shoved into a holding cell, just a boy among men hardened by years of violence, addiction, and survival. But even there, he stood out. His shoulders wide, his fists heavy, his eyes burning with a fire none of the other inmates dared to challenge. One man muttered from the corner, "Kid, what you in for?" Mike's voice was low but steady. "Defending my mom." Heads nodded slowly. Respect, not pity, filled the silence. They all knew what that meant. Meanwhile, in a cramped office down the hall, Officer Raymond Doyle sat with ice pressed against his jaw, his face twisted in both pain and humiliation. His partner, Officer Greg Turner, leaned against the desk, his voice sharp. "You let a teenager drop you in front of half the block," Turner muttered. "You realize how bad that looks?" Doyle slammed the ice pack onto the desk. "I don't care how it looks. That punk put his hands on me. That's assaulting an officer. End of story. Turner raised an eyebrow. End of story? Doyle, the whole neighborhood saw you with your hands on his mom. This isn't going to vanish. Doyle's eyes narrowed, venom dripping from his voice. It'll vanish when I make it vanish. Who are they going to believe? A street kid with a temper? Or a decorated cop? Turner didn't respond. He didn't have to. They both knew how the system worked. News of the arrest traveled faster than Doyle expected. By the next morning, the Tyson home was surrounded by neighbors, family friends, and even local reporters eager to dig into the story. Some held hand-painted signs, others shouted into cameras. A community was rallying not just for Gloria, but for the boy who had dared to do what so many only dreamed of, stand up. That same morning, in a dimly lit office lined with dusty law books, Anthony Reed, a young black attorney with ambition burning in his veins, answered a phone call that would change his career forever. Young man, the voice said. It was Denise Walker, Gloria's longtime friend. They got Mike locked up. They're trying to make him out to be the criminal when everybody saw that cop choking Gloria. We need you. Now. Anthony leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. He was only a few years out of law school, hungry for cases that mattered. And this? This was more than a case. This was a fight for truth. I'll be there, he said simply, grabbing his worn leather briefcase. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and stale air. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, dust dancing in the beams. Rows of benches filled quickly, neighbors, journalists, curious onlookers, all eager to see the boy who had dared to strike a cop. At the defense table, Mike sat stiffly, his mother beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Her throat still bore the faint bruises of Doyle's grip, though she wore a scarf to hide them. Her eyes, however, gave everything away: fire, pain, and unbreakable resolve. Anthony Reed adjusted his tie nervously, flipping through his notes. He was young, yes, but not blind. He saw the way people craned their necks to glimpse Mike, the way reporters scribbled furiously. This wasn't just a case, it was a storm. At the plaintiff's table sat Doyle, smug in his freshly pressed uniform, his bruised jaw hidden behind forced confidence. Turner sat nearby, arms crossed, his stare icy. Then came the voice that silenced the room. All rise for Judge Harold Whitman. An older white man with thinning gray hair and a stern face entered, his robe sweeping behind him. His gaze carried years of authority, but also something else, a weariness from having seen too many cases like this one. You may be seated, Whitman said, his tone measured. He glanced over the courtroom, his eyes lingering briefly on Gloria's scarf before settling on Doyle's stiff posture. Let's proceed. The prosecutor, a sharp man with a suit tailored to intimidate, stood tall. Your Honor, this is a simple case. The defendant, Michael Tyson, assaulted a police officer in the line of duty. Officer Doyle will now explain the events as they occurred. Doyle rose, striding to the stand with exaggerated purpose. He took the oath, his smirk faint but undeniable, before settling into the chair. His voice was steady, rehearsed. On the afternoon in question, I observed a woman loitering near a storefront. When I approached and asked her for identification, she became hostile. Her son, Michael Tyson, suddenly attacked me without provocation. He struck me in the jaw with his fist, knocking me to the ground. I feared for my safety. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but Doyle pressed on. I've been an officer for over a decade. I know when I'm under threat. That boy attacked me, plain and simple. The prosecutor nodded approvingly. No further questions. Doyle stepped down, his expression smug, his gaze darting toward Gloria and Mike with unspoken malice. It was Anthony Reed's turn. He rose slowly, his palms sweating, his heart racing. But when he glanced at Gloria and saw the quiet strength in her eyes, his nerves settled. Your Honor, he began, before we continue, I'd like to call Gloria Tyson to the stand. The room hushed as Gloria rose. She moved with grace, her scarf wrapped neatly, her posture unshaken despite the weight pressing down on her. She swore the oath and sat, her hands folded neatly on her lap. "Mrs. Tyson," Anthony began gently, "can you describe what happened on the day in question?" Gloria's voice was hoarse but steady. "I was walking home from the store, that's all. Officer Doyle stopped me, accused me of loitering. When I told him I lived nearby, he grabbed my arm. When I tried to pull away, he threw my groceries down and put his hand on my throat." A murmur swept the room. Doyle shifted uneasily, his jaw tightening. Anthony leaned in. "And what happened next?" Gloria's eyes flickered to her son, then back to the jury. "My boy ran to protect me. He hit the officer to make him let go, that's all. He didn't attack out of anger. He defended his mother's life." The silence that followed was heavy, electric. Even Judge Whitman leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. At that moment, the case was no longer just about an assault charge. It was about truth versus lies, power versus dignity, the system versus the people who lived beneath its weight. And for the first time, Doyle's confident mask began to crack. The prosecutor adjusted his tie, preparing to object, but Judge Whitman raised a hand. "The witness will continue." Gloria's voice never wavered, though her bruised throat made each word an effort. "He had me pinned. I couldn't breathe. If my son hadn't stepped in when he did, I don't know what would have happened." The courtroom buzzed, whispers rippling across the benches like a wave. A mother choked in daylight, a boy forced to strike a man twice his size just to save her. It wasn't the story Doyle had painted, and everyone could feel the tension twisting tighter. Anthony Reed clasped his hands behind his back, pacing slowly. "Mrs. Tyson, did you, at any point, act aggressively toward Officer Doyle?" "No," Gloria replied firmly. "I told him I was heading home, that's all." "And your son, did he strike Officer Doyle out of anger?" Her eyes softened as they landed on Mike. "No, he struck to save me." Anthony turned to the jury, his voice rising. "A mother's throat in a chokehold, a son stepping in to protect her. Is that assault, or is that instinct? Is that crime or courage?" The prosecutor leapt to his feet. "Objection. Counsel is arguing with the jury." "Sustained," Judge Whitman said evenly, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of thought. Anthony bowed his head slightly. "No further questions, Your Honor." Gloria stepped down slowly, her head held high, her scarf slipping just enough for the jury to glimpse the bruises beneath. Gasps echoed again, louder this time, before the judge's gavel restored order. The prosecutor stood, his smile sharp, his tone dripping with condescension. "Mrs. Tyson, let's be clear. You claim this officer, a man with 10 years of service, simply attacked you without cause?" "Yes. And you expect this court to believe that your teenage son just happened to strike him out of, what, heroism?" Gloria didn't blink. "Out of survival." The prosecutor's smile faltered. He leaned closer, his voice harder now. "Isn't it true your son has a history of fighting in the streets?" Anthony was on his feet instantly. "Objection. Irrelevant." The judge's gavel cracked. "Sustained. Stick to the facts, counselor." The prosecutor clenched his jaw but pressed on. "Mrs. Tyson, emotions cloud memory. Are you sure you didn't provoke this? Raise your voice? Threaten him?" Gloria's voice dropped, quiet but fierce. "I didn't have to raise my voice." He raised his hands. The words landed like a hammer. Even the stenographer's keys paused mid-stroke. The silence stretching before the gavel restored order once more. "No further questions?" the prosecutor muttered, his confidence shaken. All eyes shifted now to Mike Tyson, the teenager who had already become a symbol half criminal in the eyes of the prosecution, half hero in the eyes of his community. "Michael Tyson," Judge Whitman said, his tone sharp. "Take the stand." Mike rose slowly, the shackles of youth heavy on his shoulders, but his posture already carried the strength of the fighter he was destined to be. He swore the oath, then sat, his dark eyes fixed on the jury. Anthony Reed stepped forward carefully, knowing the boy's temper, knowing how easily a few words could be twisted. "Mike," he began softly, "tell the court what you saw." Mike's voice was low, steady. "I saw a man choking my mother. I saw her fighting for air, and I did what any son would do." Anthony nodded. "Did you strike Officer Doyle because you wanted to hurt him?" Mike shook his head. I struck him because he wouldn't stop. And what happened after? They dragged me off her. They didn't care what he did to her. They only cared that I touched him. The jury shifted uncomfortably. The truth had a way of doing that, forcing people to reckon with what they'd rather ignore. When it was the prosecutor's turn, he circled Mike like a hawk, his tone sharp. So, you admit you hit a police officer? Yes, Mike said without hesitation. Gasps rippled again. The prosecutor's smirk widened. So you assaulted him? I defended her, Mike replied. That's not what the law says, son. Mike's jaw tightened, his fists flexing against the wooden railing of the stand. Then maybe the law's wrong. The courtroom exploded, gasps, shouts, murmurs, some in awe, some in outrage. The gavel pounded furiously. Order! Judge Whitman roared. I will have order. When silence fell again, the prosecutor leaned closer, his voice almost mocking. You think you're above the law? Mike's eyes burned. No, but I know my mother's life is worth more than his badge. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Doyle's face flushed crimson, his fists clenching on the table. For the first time, his composure cracked. Before the day ended, Anthony made a move no one expected. Your Honor, the defense calls Denise Walker. A stir rippled through the courtroom. Denise, Gloria's longtime friend, rose from the gallery, her presence commanding. She took the oath, her voice steady. I was there, she said. I saw the whole thing. That cop wasn't attacked. He was the attacker. Gloria couldn't breathe. That boy saved her. The prosecutor scrambled. Objection, this witness wasn't disclosed. Judge Whitman cut him off. Overruled. Continue. Denise's testimony was simple, direct, devastating. Every word chipped away at Doyle's story, piece by piece. By the time she stepped down, the courtroom no longer saw just a decorated officer. They saw a liar cornered by truth. As the day's session ended, the crowd spilled into the street outside, buzzing like a hive. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, neighbors raised their fists in solidarity. Inside, Doyle sat stiffly, sweat beading on his forehead. Turner leaned close, whispering harshly, They're not buying it. You better hold your story together. Doyle's eyes flickered with desperation. I will. I have to. But deep down, even he knew the wall was starting to crack. And in that crack, the truth was already shining through. The morning sun broke through the courthouse windows, scattering gold across the polished floor. Reporters clustered outside in a frenzy, microphones flashing, voices rising over one another. The story had already grown beyond Brownsville. It wasn't just about Mike Tyson anymore. It was about a boy, a mother, and a cop's chokehold that could no longer be hidden. Inside, the courtroom was packed tighter than ever. Neighbors filled every bench, their eyes sharp with defiance. Journalists scribbled furiously, cameras rolling discreetly from the back rows. Even officers from Doyle's own precinct lined the wall silent, arms folded, expressions unreadable. Mike sat at the defense table, his shoulders square, his jaw tight. He looked older than his years, carved by the weight of what had happened. Beside him, Gloria sat tall despite the bruises that lingered under her scarf. Her hand rested lightly on his, the bond between them unshakable. Anthony Reed shuffled papers, but his eyes were elsewhere on Doyle, who sat at the plaintiff's table with Turner at his side. Doyle's jaw was still swollen, but his arrogance had returned. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the wood, the faint smirk on his lips, daring anyone to challenge his authority. The gavel cracked. Court is now in session, Judge Whitman declared, his tone sharp. The prosecutor rose swiftly. Your Honor, the state calls Officer Raymond Doyle back to the stand. Doyle walked with a deliberate swagger, his uniform immaculate, his posture exaggerated. He swore the oath again, then settled into the witness chair, his hands folded tightly. Officer Doyle, the prosecutor began smoothly, there's been conflicting testimony. Would you clarify for the jury exactly what happened on that street? Doyle's voice was low, steady, rehearsed. I approached a woman who appeared suspicious near a storefront. I asked for identification. She became hostile. When her son arrived, he rushed me and struck me without warning. I was blindsided. Anthony's jaw tightened. Doyle was sticking to his script, word for word. The prosecutor pressed on. Did you at any time place your hands on Mrs. Tyson's throat? Doyle shook his head firmly. No, absolutely not. I attempted to restrain her arm when she resisted, but I never choked her. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Gloria's eyes widened with fury, but she stayed seated, her hand gripping the edge of the table. And this supposed witness, Doyle sneered, glancing at Denise Walker in the gallery, was across the street. She couldn't see what really happened. What she's saying is biased. Prosecutor smiled faintly. So, to be clear, you were the victim of an unprovoked assault. That's right, Doyle said, his voice rising with false conviction. I was attacked for doing my job. Anthony rose slowly, buttoning his jacket. He stepped toward Doyle with deliberate calm. Officer Doyle, you've testified you never placed your hands on Mrs. Tyson's throat. Is that correct? Yes. Anthony paused, tilting his head, and yet Mrs. Tyson's neck still bears visible bruises. How do you explain that? Doyle's eyes flickered for just a moment before he replied, I restrained her arm. In the scuffle, maybe she bruised herself against the wall. The gallery erupted in laughter and disbelief. Even the judge's gavel took longer than usual to quiet the noise. Anthony leaned closer, his voice sharp. So we're to believe she somehow strangled herself against a brick wall while you were conveniently grabbing her arm. Doyle's jaw tightened. I did my duty, nothing more. Anthony turned to the jury, his voice rising. Ladies and gentlemen, bruises don't lie. Necks don't bruise themselves. This officer did more than his duty. He crossed the line, and now he wants this boy to pay for it. The prosecutor objected, but the judge allowed it. Doyle's composure wavered. For the first time, sweat glistened on his forehead. While testimony unfolded inside, the courthouse steps had become a rallying ground. Dozens of neighbors gathered daily now, carrying signs scrawled with words like "Justice for Gloria" and "Free Mike Tyson." Local activists brought megaphones, their chants echoing off stone walls. "Hands off our mothers," they shouted. "Hands off our sons." The story spread to local papers, then regional broadcasts. Headlines called it the Tyson case. Some painted Mike as a dangerous youth. Others called him a hero. But the narrative was no longer controlled by the police. It belonged to the people who had seen it happen. Gloria, escorted in and out of court each day, was greeted with applause and raised fists. "We're with you, Miss Tyson," neighbors called. Mike, too, though guarded, received cheers from young boys who whispered to one another. He stood up. He fought back. Back inside, the prosecution attempted to call Turner as reinforcement. Turner took the stand, his broad shoulders tense, his eyes darting. "Officer Turner," the prosecutor began, "you arrived as backup. What did you see?" Turner cleared his throat. "I saw the defendant strike Officer Doyle. I saw Doyle go down. It was violent, unprovoked." Anthony stood. "Officer Turner, did you see how Mrs. Tyson got the bruises on her throat?" Turner hesitated just long enough for the jury to notice. "No, I can't say I did." "So you didn't see her choke herself against the wall as Doyle suggested?" Turner shifted, his jaw tight. "No." "Then who did it?" Anthony pressed. Turner's silence filled the room. The jury leaned forward. The crack was there, small but undeniable. By mid-afternoon, the tension was unbearable. The gavel cracked down harder than ever before. "This is not a circus," Judge Whitman barked, his stern gaze sweeping the room. "But let me remind both counsels, truth is the foundation of this court, and I will not tolerate evasions." His eyes lingered on Doyle and Turner just a moment longer than necessary. Doyle shifted uncomfortably in his seat. After court adjourned for the day, Anthony met Gloria and Mike in a quiet room. His tie was loosened, his brow furrowed. "They're sticking to their story," Anthony said, frustration in his voice, "even when it doesn't make sense." Gloria leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "Then make it make sense to that jury. Show them what we lived. Don't let his lies stand taller than the truth." Mike's voice was low, steady. "I don't care what happens to me. Just make sure they know what he did to her." Anthony looked at the boy, seeing not just a teenager, but a fighter born from fire. He nodded slowly. "We'll get there, but it won't be with words alone. We need proof. That night, Anthony dug deeper. He pored over Doyle's personnel file, searching for patterns, complaints, reports, anything, and he found them. Buried under layers of bureaucracy, hidden in the shadows of departmental silence, complaints of excessive force, whispers of bias, reports of chokeholds eerily similar to Gloria's. It wasn't enough to win the case outright, but it was the start of a fire that could burn Doyle's story to ashes. Anthony leaned back in his chair, exhaustion etched into his face. He whispered to himself, "Tomorrow, we change everything." The battle wasn't over. It had barely begun, but the courtroom walls were no longer Doyle's shield. They were closing in. The next morning, the courthouse buzzed like a hive before dawn. Reporters jostled for position, cameras trained on the entrance. Protesters held larger, sharper signs, now "End police lies," "Justice for the Tysons," "Protect our mothers." The Tyson case had outgrown Brooklyn. It was now a symbol of resistance, of truth, of a fight bigger than one family. Inside, the atmosphere was thick enough to choke. Every bench was filled, whispers echoing like static. The jury filed in, their faces tense. Judge Whitman took his seat, his gavel cracking through the murmurs. "Court will come to order," he announced. "Mr. Reed, you may proceed." Anthony stood, a folder clutched in his hands. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned with fire. "Your Honor, the defense wishes to introduce new evidence regarding Officer Raymond Doyle's conduct during his tenure on the force." The prosecutor shot up instantly. "Objection, irrelevant to the current charges." But Judge Whitman raised a hand. "I'll allow it for now, but you'd better tread carefully, Counselor." Anthony nodded. He turned to the jury, holding up the folder. "Ladies and gentlemen, the truth often hides in shadows. Today I bring those shadows into light." Anthony handed copies of documents to the jury. Contained in these records are multiple complaints filed against Officer Doyle over the last 10 years. Complaints of excessive force, intimidation, and specifically use of chokeholds. Gasps rippled through the room. Doyle shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. Anthony's voice sharpened. "These aren't isolated incidents. They're a pattern of behavior that mirrors exactly what Mrs. Tyson described." The prosecutor barked, "Unproven allegations." Anthony cut him off, his voice ringing. "Unproven because they were buried under the very system that now asks you to trust this man's word over the bruises on a woman's neck." The gallery erupted. Murmurs of anger and disbelief filled the air. Judge Whitman pounded his gavel furiously. "Order! I will have order!" But the truth had landed, and Doyle's mask of authority was starting to fracture. Anthony turned back to Doyle. "Officer Doyle, do you deny these complaints exist?" Doyle's face flushed. "They were dismissed. None of them stuck." "That's not what I asked," Anthony pressed. "Do you deny they exist?" Doyle's silence was answer enough. The jury leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Anthony stepped closer, his voice like a blade. "So when you claim you never choked Mrs. Tyson, should we believe you over her bruises, over her testimony, over the complaints of other citizens who tell the same story?" Doyle gripped the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles whitened. "I did my job." Anthony's voice thundered. "Your job, Officer Doyle, or your habit?" The gallery gasped again. Judge Whitman's gavel slammed down, but even he couldn't hide the flicker of unease in his eyes. During recess, Gloria sat quietly in the hallway, her scarf loosened now. Neighbors approached her, offering hugs, whispered encouragement. "We're proud of you, Miss Tyson. You're stronger than all of them." A reporter shoved a microphone close. "Mrs. Tyson, do you feel vindicated after today's revelations?" Gloria's voice was calm, steady. "Vindication comes when the truth is no longer doubted. Until then, I'll keep speaking it." The cameras captured her face dignity carved into every line, her bruises no longer just wounds but symbols of resilience. By evening, her words would flash across television screens. She wasn't just a defendant's mother anymore. She was a voice of justice. When court resumed, Anthony turned his attention back to Turner. "Officer Turner, you testified you didn't see how Mrs. Tyson got her bruises. Do you stand by that?" "Yes," Turner said, his tone clipped. Anthony leaned in. But you saw Doyle grab her, didn't you? Turner hesitated. The pause stretched like a wire pulled tight. The jury noticed. Finally, he muttered, "I saw him make contact." The courtroom erupted. Shouts of "Liar! We knew it!" filled the air. Turner's credibility cracked in an instant. Doyle shot him a glare that could cut glass, but the damage was done. Anthony pressed further. "So, Doyle's story isn't the whole truth, is it?" Turner stammered. I can't say." "You just did," Anthony said coldly. For the first time since the trial began, Judge Whitman leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Doyle. His voice was measured, but its weight was unmistakable. "Officer Doyle, this court takes patterns of misconduct very seriously. If what we're hearing has merit, it casts grave doubt on your testimony." Doyle's face hardened, but his eyes betrayed fear. The judge's gavel struck once more. "Proceed." Outside, the courthouse steps had become more than a protest, they were a rally. Ministers prayed aloud, mothers led chants, teenagers passed out flyers. The air pulsed with unity. Local news anchors stood in front of cameras, reporting live. This case is quickly becoming more than a trial. For many here, it's a reckoning. And through it all, the name Tyson echoed not for boxing, not for fists in a ring, but for a boy who struck once for his mother and set fire to a system. Back inside, Doyle grew restless. Each question chipped at his authority. Each murmur from the gallery tightened the noose around his story. Finally, under cross-examination, he snapped. "They don't respect authority," he shouted, pointing at Mike and Gloria. "People like them always questioning, always resisting." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Gasps, shouts, outrage. Judge Whitman's gavel pounded like thunder. "Order! Order in this court!" But the damage was irreversible. Doyle's words hung in the air, naked, raw, undeniable. Not the testimony of a victim. The rant of a man unmasked. As the session adjourned, the crowd spilled into the street once more, their voices louder than ever. "Did you hear him? He showed his true colors. The whole country needs to see this." Anthony walked out with Gloria and Mike, reporters swarming. "Counselor, is this a turning point?" Anthony's reply was simple. "Truth always is." Gloria raised her head high, her voice carrying across the steps. "We're not afraid, not anymore." And the cheers that followed shook the stone walls. The courthouse emptied under a sky heavy with storm clouds. The chants outside grew louder, echoing down every street. "Justice for Gloria! Justice for Mike!" Banners waved, cameras flashed, and the police presence doubled, officers in stiff lines trying to contain a tide that only swelled larger. Inside, in the judge's chambers, voices clashed. "This trial is spiraling out of control," the prosecutor hissed, his face red. "The defense is turning it into a circus. Complaints, protests, theatrics, none of it should be admissible." Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, his gray eyes fixed on the man before him. None of it would matter if your officer hadn't cracked on the stand. He showed his prejudice, and the jury saw it. The prosecutor slammed a hand on the table. "Then shut it down. Keep the complaints sealed. Remind the defense of their limits." The judge's face hardened. "This court doesn't exist to protect reputations. It exists to find truth." But even as he said it, Whitman felt the weight of pressure pressing from above, phone calls from city officials, whispers from the department, warnings that this case could unravel more than one career. That night, Anthony Reed walked alone to his car, the courthouse parking lot dimly lit. His briefcase hung heavy in his hand, his thoughts heavier still. He had the truth, yes, but the truth was dangerous. From the shadows, a voice drawled, "Counselor." Anthony froze. Two men stepped forward, plainclothes, but everything about them screamed police. Broad shoulders, clipped haircuts, the weight of authority carried like a weapon. One smirked. "You're digging too deep. Pull those files again tomorrow and you'll regret it." Anthony tightened his grip on his case. "Is that a threat?" The other man stepped closer, his voice low. "It's advice. You've got a nice career ahead of you. Don't throw it away over one punk kid and his mama." Anthony's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You think I'm scared of shadows?" The men chuckled, their footsteps fading into the night. But Anthony knew this was no idle warning. The system was circling the wagons. Back in the small Tyson apartment, the night was restless. Gloria sat at the table, her scarf folded neatly beside her, her neck still tender. Mike paced the floor, fists clenching and unclenching. "They want to bury us," he said, his voice low but fierce. "They want to make me the criminal." Gloria reached for his arm. "Michael, listen to me. They've tried to bury us our whole lives, but we don't bend. We don't break." Mike's eyes burned. "I'm not afraid of them. Not him, not the court, not anyone." Gloria looked at her son, the boy she raised in struggle, now standing like a man forged in fire. "That's why they fear you," she whispered. The courtroom was even more crowded. National media had arrived now, their cameras rolling, their voices narrating every step. The Tyson case was no longer just Brooklyn's fight, it was America's. The prosecutor opened with venom, his words sharp as knives. "Your Honor, the defense has turned this trial into a witch hunt against a decorated officer. We move to strike the personnel records from evidence." Anthony shot up. "Your Honor, these records are directly relevant. They show a pattern that matches my client's testimony exactly." The judge raised a hand. "Motion denied, the records stay." The prosecutor's jaw tightened, his teeth grinding audibly. But the decision stood. The walls around Doyle grew thinner. On the stand again, Doyle's composure shattered further. Anthony's questions were simple, relentless. "Officer Doyle, how many chokehold complaints have you faced?" "3. "And how many times were those citizens charged, as my client is now?" "All of them." "And were those charges later dropped?" Silence. The gallery erupted, voices rising in outrage. The gavel slammed, but the truth had already struck. Doyle's face twisted, his voice breaking into a snarl. "They lie. They all lie. People like them." He caught himself, but it was too late. The words had already scorched the air. The jury stared, their expressions a mix of shock and disgust. Gloria's eyes closed briefly, not in defeat, but in silent prayer. The mask had fallen. As court recessed, the protesters outside swelled into hundreds. Television trucks lined the streets. News anchors shouted over chants that thundered through the city. Today, Officer Doyle admitted to multiple complaints of force, the story shaking the department. Supporters rallying behind the Tyson family, calling this trial a fight for dignity. Police tried to push the crowd back, but each shove was met with louder chants. "Hands off our mothers! Hands off our sons!" Brooklyn wasn't just watching anymore. It was rising. That evening, in his chambers, Judge Whitman sat alone, staring at a stack of files. He rubbed his temples, exhaustion etched in his face. He had spent decades trying to balance law and justice, but never had the line felt so sharp. A knock at the door. His clerk entered, whispering, "Judge, the mayor's office called again. They want this trial controlled." Whitman closed his eyes. "Controlled?" They said, "The city can't afford for this to spiral." The judge's gavel rested on his desk, heavy and silent. He whispered to himself, "Justice isn't supposed to be convenient." That night, Mike sat with his mother again, the hum of the city outside their window. His fists rested on the table, scarred from chains, scarred from fights, scarred from life. "Ma," he said softly, "they can lock me up, they can lie, but they'll never forget what I did for you." Gloria's hand covered his. "Michael, the world will know the truth, and the truth is, you're not just my son. You're proof they can't break us." Mike nodded slowly, his young face hardening into steel. It was the face of a fighter, long before the ring. The trial was far from over, but with every word, every crack in Doyle's story, every chant outside the courthouse, the scales began to shift, and everyone knew the storm was only just beginning. The 6th day of the trial opened under gray skies. Rain streaked down courthouse windows, the sound muffled but steady, like a warning drumbeat. Yet outside, the crowd still gathered, umbrellas bobbing, voices undimmed. They had come too far to stay home now. Inside, the courtroom brimmed with tension. The jury shifted in their seats, weary from days of testimony, but sharp-eyed still. Gloria sat with quiet dignity at the defense table, her hand resting lightly on her son's shoulder. Mike stared ahead, his jaw set, his fists tightening each time Doyle glanced their way. Anthony Reed stacked his papers neatly, bracing himself. He knew the prosecution was cornered, and cornered men struck back viciously. The gavel cracked. "Court is in session," Judge Whitman announced. The prosecutor rose with unusual vigor, his eyes glinting with strategy. "Your Honor, the state calls its next witness, Officer Mark Hensley." Murmurs rippled across the courtroom. Hensley was a name people knew, a long-time officer, respected by some, feared by others. He strode to the stand, uniform crisp, expression unreadable. After the oath, the prosecutor's tone was smooth. "Officer Hensley, you reviewed the reports from that day?" "Yes." "And based on your expertise, would you say Officer Doyle acted within protocol?" "Absolutely," Hensley said firmly. "From what I saw in the aftermath, Doyle was assaulted. His injuries were consistent with a violent attack." Gasps swept the gallery. Gloria's eyes narrowed. Anthony scribbled notes, his jaw tight. The prosecutor pressed further. "And Mrs. Tyson, did you observe her condition?" Hensley nodded. "I did. She was upset, but there were no visible injuries when I saw her. No bruising." The gallery erupted. Shouts of "Liar!" and "We saw them!" filled the air. The gavel thundered. "Order!" Judge Whitman barked. But the damage had been done. A seed of doubt had been planted. Anthony rose slowly, his voice cool. "Officer Hensley, when exactly did you see Mrs. Tyson?" "Later that evening at the station." Anthony nodded. "After she had been in custody for hours. After she had time to cover bruises with a scarf. Isn't that correct?" Hensley hesitated. "I can't confirm that." "And you didn't witness the incident yourself, did you?" "No." Anthony leaned in. "So all you really know is what Doyle told you. You didn't see him choke her. You didn't see the boy strike him until after she was attacked. You're repeating his story, aren't you?" Hensley's jaw tightened. "I stand by my assessment." Anthony turned to the jury, his voice rising. "Ladies and gentlemen, hearsay dressed in uniform is still hearsay. This officer didn't see what happened. You did, through bruises, through witnesses, through the truth itself." The gallery roared. The gavel slammed, but the spark had caught. The prosecutor wasn't finished. He flipped through his notes and adjusted his tie. "Your Honor, the state also introduces school records from the defendant. Records showing disciplinary issues, fights, disruptions." Gasps rippled. Gloria's face paled. Mike's fists clenched. Anthony shot to his feet. "Objection. Irrelevant and prejudicial." The judge considered. "Overruled. The jury will hear it." The prosecutor's smile widened. "Michael Tyson has a history of violence. This wasn't defense, it was instinct. He's a boy prone to fists, and he struck a police officer the same way he struck classmates." The words hung like poison in the air. The gallery murmured uneasily. Some jurors frowned. Anthony felt his chest tighten. He knew Mike's past scraps on the streets, anger from a childhood clawing through hardship. But he also knew this moment wasn't about past scars. It was about truth. Anthony stood quickly, signaling to the judge. "Your Honor, I request to recall the defendant." Mike returned to the stand, his fists resting on the railing, his eyes locked on the jury. Anthony's voice was steady. "Mike, the prosecution says you're violent, that this was just another fight. What do you say?" Mike took a breath, his voice low but powerful. "I fought when I had to, because where I grew up, you don't get a choice. But that day, that wasn't about me. That was about my mom. She couldn't breathe, and I'd do it again, every time. Because no law says a boy should watch his mother die." The courtroom froze. Even the prosecutor's smirk faltered. Judge Whitman's gavel cracked, but softer this time, as if even he felt the weight of the boy's words. News spread like wildfire. Clips of Mike's testimony flooded evening broadcasts. Anchors repeated his words, each syllable striking deeper. No law says a boy should watch his mother die. On the courthouse steps, protesters swelled into the hundreds, then thousands. Preachers raised voices, mothers held signs, teenagers chanted Mike's name. Police lined the steps, tension thick, but the crowd didn't waver. They sang, they shouted, they prayed. The Tyson case was no longer just a trial. It was a mirror reflecting a nation's wounds. Inside, the prosecutor was cornered. He launched his final attack with venom. "Michael Tyson, you've admitted to fighting before. You admit you hit an officer. Tell us, are you proud of that punch?" Mike's gaze didn't flicker. "I'm proud I saved my mom." The jury leaned forward. The gallery erupted. The gavel thundered, but nothing could drown the truth. Doyle's face twisted with rage, his fists clenching on the table. Turner looked away, shame etched into his features. For the first time, the system itself seemed to tremble. As court adjourned, Anthony leaned close to Gloria and Mike. "They're running out of moves. Tomorrow we bring the hammer down." Gloria's voice was quiet, resolute. "Tomorrow the world sees them for who they are." Mike's fists unclenched slowly. "And sees me for who I am." The gavel cracked one last time, but the echo didn't linger in the wood. It lingered in every heart in the room. The courthouse was electric before dawn. The air hummed with anticipation, as though the city itself sensed the trial was reaching a point of no return. The steps outside were already crowded, voices rising in chants, umbrellas and cardboard signs waving despite the drizzle. "Justice for Gloria! Free Mike! Stop the chokeholds!" Inside, the courtroom was swollen with bodies. Neighbors pressed shoulder to shoulder, reporters hunched over notepads, television cameras discreetly rolled from the gallery's back corners. The jurors shifted uneasily, knowing each word they heard now carried the weight of history. Anthony Reed straightened his tie, his face set like stone. In his hand was a folder heavier than any briefcase evidence he had fought to obtain, evidence he knew could either shatter Doyle's lies or be buried under technicalities. The gavel cracked. Judge Whitman's voice carried over the buzz. "Court is now in session. Counselor, you may proceed." Anthony stepped forward, his voice clear. "Your Honor, the defense submits new evidence, a bystander video recorded on the day in question. It shows exactly what happened on Amboy Street." The prosecutor shot to his feet. "Objection! This is inadmissible. No chain of custody, no verification." Anthony's voice cut through. "The source has been verified by independent experts, and more importantly, the jury deserves to see the truth." Judge Whitman leaned back, his expression grave. "Overruled. Play the tape." A bailiff dimmed the lights. The projector flickered to life, casting shaky footage across the courtroom wall. The crowd held its breath. The video showed Gloria pressed against the brick wall, Doyle's thick hand clamped around her throat. Her groceries lay scattered across the sidewalk. Her face strained, her voice muffled but clear. "I can't breathe." Gasps filled the room. Some jurors covered their mouths. Gloria's eyes glistened, though she sat tall, refusing to flinch. Then, like a thunderclap, Mike appeared in the frame, a boy charging, fists clenched, rage and desperation colliding in one motion. His punch landed squarely, Doyle's head snapping back, his body collapsing to the ground. The video ended. Silence reigned. Judge Whitman's gavel struck, but softer than usual, as though even he was shaken. All eyes turned to Doyle. His face was pale, his jaw tight, sweat gathering at his temples. For days he had clung to his story, but the footage had ripped it apart in seconds. Anthony's voice was sharp. "Officer Doyle, would you like to explain to this court why the jury just saw your hand around Mrs. Tyson's throat when you swore under oath that it never happened?" The gallery erupted, gasps, shouts, outrage. The gavel thundered. "Order!" Doyle's mouth opened, but no words came. His lips trembled, his eyes darted. For the first time, the mask was gone. Anthony pressed harder. "You lied. You lied to this court, to this jury, to this community, and now the truth has exposed you." Doyle slammed his fists on the table. She resisted, but the words collapsed under the weight of the video. The jury's eyes were no longer neutral. They were cold, piercing, unforgiving. The prosecutor scrambled, his voice sharp. Your Honor, this video doesn't capture the entire context. Anthony cut him off. The context is a mother being choked in daylight. The context is a boy forced to save her life. The context is truth. The crowd roared, rising to their feet. Some cried openly, others shouted in triumph. The gavel pounded furiously. "Order! I will clear this courtroom if necessary," Judge Whitman barked, but even his voice couldn't muffle the tide. The truth was out, and it would not be stuffed back into silence. When the gallery calmed, Anthony turned to Turner. "Officer Turner, you testified you didn't see Mrs. Tyson's bruises. After watching this video, do you stand by that?" Turner's face paled, his voice faltered. I can't deny what's on the screen." Anthony pressed. "So Doyle lied?" Turner's eyes flickered to his partner, then back to the floor. "Yes." The room exploded again. Doyle lunged toward him, restrained only by his lawyer's arm. His voice cracked with rage. "You spineless coward!" But Turner didn't look up. He knew the wall of silence had cracked, and there was no repairing it. Anthony called Gloria once more. She walked to the stand slowly, her scarf loosened, her throat still bearing faint bruises. She swore the oath, then looked straight at the jury. Her voice was soft, but each word cut like a blade. "I told the truth from the start. That officer put his hands on me, and my boy saved me. You've seen it now. You've seen what I lived." Her eyes glistened, but her posture never bent. "I've been poor, I've been black, I've been ignored, but I've never lied, and I won't let my son be buried under a lie." The silence that followed was heavy, holy. Even the judge leaned back, his eyes lowered. News of the video spread like wildfire. By the afternoon, the courthouse steps swelled with thousands. Television trucks lined the blocks. National anchors shouted into microphones. One reporter spoke over the roar, "This trial has become a flashpoint. The video evidence directly contradicts Officer Doyle's testimony, and the community is rallying harder than ever behind the Tyson family." The chants shook the air. "Free Mike Tyson! Free Mike Tyson!" Police lines strained, but the crowd only grew louder, their voices carrying across Brooklyn like thunder. Back inside, during a recess, Doyle sat hunched, his face twisted, his fists trembling. He muttered to Turner, unaware that others overheard. "They think they can ruin me. They'll regret this. That kid, that woman, that lawyer, they'll all regret it." Turner recoiled, shaking his head. "You've ruined yourself, Ray." The words sliced deeper than any punch. Doyle's glare could have shattered glass, but the truth had already destroyed him. When court reconvened, Judge Whitman's face was stern, his voice heavy. "This trial has revealed not only the events of one afternoon, but the deeper cracks in the system meant to serve us all. The jury will deliberate soon, but make no mistake, perjury will not be ignored." His eyes fell on Doyle, who squirmed under the weight, and for the first time, the room seemed to believe not in law, not in procedure, but in the possibility of justice. As the session ended, Mike stood beside his mother, chains on his wrists, but fire in his eyes. Reporters shouted, cameras flashed. "Mike, do you have anything to say?" one called. Mike's voice cut through the chaos, calm and steady. "I did what any son would do. I saved my mom, and I'll never apologize for that." The crowd outside roared as the words echoed beyond the courthouse walls. And in that moment, the legend grew, not of a champion in the ring, but of a boy who refused to break. The rain had stopped, but Brooklyn was drenched in tension. Streets surrounding the courthouse were clogged with crowds, neighbors, activists, reporters, families, thousands waiting for a verdict that felt bigger than a single boy or a single mother. Inside, the courtroom sat heavy with silence. The jury had been dismissed hours ago, retreating behind closed doors to deliberate. Now, every tick of the clock felt like a drumbeat, every creak of the wooden benches a thunderclap. Gloria sat beside her son, her hand clasped over his cuffed wrist. She whispered softly, "No matter what happens, Michael, you stood for me. That's a victory they can't erase." Mike's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. His eyes stared straight ahead, burning with the steel of a fighter in training, long before he ever laced up gloves. Anthony Reed paced near the defense table, his briefcase unopened. His career rested on this case, but it was more than that. It was his community's voice carried through him. He knew the jury's decision wouldn't just define Mike, it would echo across every block of Brooklyn. In the jury room, 12 citizens sat around a scarred wooden table. Papers were spread out, coffee cups half empty, tension thick. One man, gray-haired and weary, broke the silence. "We all saw that video. That boy didn't attack. He defended." A younger juror, arms crossed, frowned. "But he admitted he hit a cop." "He hit him because his mother was choking," another shot back. "Would you let your mother suffocate in front of you?" The room buzzed with arguments. Some clung to the badge, others to the bruises. But every time the video replayed in their minds, Doyle's hand on Gloria's throat silenced objections. The foreman leaned forward. "This isn't just about a punch. It's about the truth. Do we believe the officer who lied or the people who bled?" Hours passed. Outside, the crowd swelled further. Television anchors narrated live, their voices carrying across radios and living rooms. Deliberations are ongoing in what many are calling the Tyson trial. The video evidence has shifted momentum dramatically. Protesters outside chanting through the night. Brooklyn was awake, restless, united in suspense. Children sat on stoops, listening to elders recount what they'd seen. Storefronts kept televisions in windows, neighbors clustering around flickering screens. For once, everyone's eyes were on the same story. The hours dragged like years. Gloria bowed her head in prayer, whispering words only she and her God could hear. Anthony scribbled notes, crossing out strategies he'd never get to use. Mike sat still, his fists resting on the table, knuckles scarred but steady. Doyle, by contrast, was unraveling. His uniform clung to him like a costume. His face shone with sweat, his eyes darting wildly. Each tick of the clock seemed to hammer him deeper into the ground. Turner sat beside him, staring at the floor, saying nothing. At last, the bailiff appeared. "The jury has reached a verdict." The room froze. Hearts pounded, breaths caught. "All rise." The jury filed in, faces grave. The foreman clutched a slip of paper, his steps deliberate. He handed it to Judge Whitman, who read silently, his expression unreadable. Finally, the judge's voice filled the room. "In the case of the people versus Michael Tyson, we, the jury, find the defendant." The air was so still it seemed the walls themselves leaned in, not guilty. The gallery erupted cheers, sobs, shouts shaking the rafters. Neighbors wept openly, fists pumping the air. Gloria clutched her son, tears streaking her cheeks, her voice breaking. "Thank you, Lord." Mike exhaled, his shoulders trembling but unbowed. Anthony gripped his hand, his voice low. "You're free, Mike. You're free." Doyle's face drained of color. His fists clenched, his jaw twisted, but the weight of the verdict crushed him. The badge that had shielded him was no longer armor, it was ashes. Turner stood slowly, shaking his head. "It's over, Ray." The gavel cracked one last time. "Court is adjourned." But the sound was drowned by the roar outside. The courthouse doors burst open, and the Tyson family stepped into a sea of humanity. The crowd surged forward, chanting Mike's name. "Mike! Mike! Mike!" Reporters shoved microphones, cameras flashed like lightning. Anthony raised his hands, trying to shield his clients, but Gloria stepped forward herself. Her voice carried over the chaos, firm and unshaken. "My son defended me. He defended every mother who's been silenced. Today, the truth won, and tomorrow we keep fighting." The cheers shook the courthouse steps. Neighbors hugged, strangers embraced, chants rising into the night sky. Far from the cameras, Doyle sat in a side hallway, his head in his hands. His career lay in ruins, his lies exposed. The department had already begun whispering about suspensions, investigations, consequences. But none of it stung worse than the look on the jury's faces when they saw the truth. For the first time, Doyle was no longer feared, he was pitied, and that was a fate worse than any verdict. Later that night, in the quiet of their apartment, Mike sat with his mother at the kitchen table. The city still hummed outside, chants lingering in the distance. Gloria touched his hand gently. "Michael, today you became a man." Mike's eyes were distant, his fists loose but ready. "I didn't want to fight, Ma, but I will, always, for you." Gloria smiled softly, tears brimming. "One day the world will know your fists. But not because of this, because of what you're meant to do." Mike nodded slowly. A boy scarred by injustice, shaped by fire, already walking the path toward becoming a legend. The trial was over. The verdict delivered, but the echoes of Amboy Street would never fade. Because on that cracked sidewalk, under a chokehold, a fighter had been born. The streets of Brooklyn pulsed with celebration. The courthouse steps, once a battleground of chants and protests, had transformed into a festival of victory. Drums beat, voices sang, and signs waved high against the night sky. "Not guilty, justice won, hands off our sons." Gloria Tyson stood in the center of it all, her scarf loosened, her bruises still visible, but no longer marks of pain, marks of survival. Neighbors embraced her, reporters thrust microphones, children tugged at her hand. "Mrs. Tyson, how does it feel to win?" a journalist shouted. Gloria's voice was steady. "It isn't about winning, it's about truth. My son saved me, and today the truth saved him." Cheers erupted, echoing down every block. By morning, newspapers across the country carried the story. Headlines screamed from every corner. "Brooklyn boy cleared in court," video shows. "Police chokehold Tyson, case rocks." City justice system television anchors spoke with urgency, their voices carrying into living rooms far from Brownsville. This case has sparked outrage and reflection across the nation. Critics point to a pattern of misconduct now impossible to ignore. The Tyson verdict may signal a turning point in community police relations. What had begun on one cracked sidewalk had now shaken an entire system. In the precinct, Officer Raymond Doyle sat in a dim locker room, his uniform crumpled, his badge heavy in his palm. His nameplate had been stripped from the wall outside. His desk cleared. Two internal affairs officers stood by the door, waiting. "You'll surrender your badge, Doyle." His voice was bitter. "After 10 years, you're throwing me out? You lied under oath. You put hands where they didn't belong. You buried yourself." Doyle slammed the badge on the bench, his jaw trembling with rage. But it wasn't just the badge he lost. It was the fear that once shielded him. Without it, he was just another man, broken and exposed. Turner passed by, his eyes cold. "You did this to yourself." Back in his office, Anthony Reed sat behind his cluttered desk, exhausted but elated. His phone rang nonstop, reporters, colleagues, even strangers offering congratulations. Denise Walker dropped by, her voice filled with pride. "You did it, Anthony. You gave us more than a verdict. You gave us a voice." Anthony leaned back, rubbing his temples. "It wasn't me. It was Gloria's courage, Mike's fire. The truth carried itself." But deep down, he knew this case had defined him. He wasn't just a young lawyer anymore. He was a fighter in his own right. In Brownsville, Mike Tyson walked through the streets, no longer just another teenager. Boys followed him, mimicking his fists, whispering his name like a legend. "That's him," they said. "That's the kid who dropped the cop." Some saw him as a hero, others as a warning, but all of them knew he was no ordinary boy anymore. At home, Gloria pulled him close. "Michael, this fight is over, but life will bring you more. Promise me you'll choose your battles wisely." Mike's eyes burned with resolve. "I'll fight when I have to, always." City officials scrambled. Press conferences were held. Promises made. "We will review chokehold policies. We will hold officers accountable." But the community knew better. Promises had been made before. Still, this case was different. The video had torn through silence. The verdict had shattered routine. The Tyson name now echoed in meetings, in headlines, in whispers across precinct walls. Late at night, when the crowds had dispersed and the cameras gone, Gloria sat at her kitchen table, the quiet pressing around her. She touched the scarf still lying on the chair, the faint bruises still tender. Her mind replayed every second the chokehold, the punch, the courtroom, and she whispered to herself, "Lord, you kept us. You carried us. Let this be the last time my son has to fight for my breath." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but they weren't just tears of sorrow. They were tears of pride. Mike sat by the window, staring into the dark city, fists resting on his knees. He thought of Doyle's sneer, the weight of the cuffs, the roar of the crowd. He thought of how a single punch had changed everything. In that moment, he understood something. Fists could do more than harm. They could defend. They could protect. They could demand respect in a world that gave none freely. He whispered to himself, almost a vow, "If my hands can save, then my hands will never stop fighting." The Tyson case left more than headlines. It left a bond. Neighbors who once walked past each other now stood united. Mothers checked in on each other's sons. Elders told children, "Don't ever forget Amboy Street." Denise Walker summed it up best on the courthouse steps. "This wasn't just Gloria's fight. It was all of ours, and we won." The aftershock was still rippling, but everyone knew something had shifted, and in the heart of it stood a boy named Mike, whose fists had struck not for fame or fortune, but for his mother's breath. The storm had passed, but its echoes remained. Weeks after the verdict, Brooklyn still pulsed with the memory of the Tyson trial. Conversations filled barbershops and church pews, front porches and corner stores. Everyone remembered the sight of a boy dropping a cop with a single punch, the sound of a verdict that rang louder than a gavel. At home, Gloria's bruises faded, but her spirit remained fierce. She carried herself taller now, her voice steady, her eyes brighter. When neighbors came by, she welcomed them with warmth. One mother hugged her tightly. "Because of you, my son walks with his head higher." Gloria smiled softly. "Because of us, this wasn't just my fight." But in the quiet of her kitchen, when the house was still, she touched her throat and remembered. The fear, the choking grip, and then the explosion of freedom when her son struck. She prayed each night that no mother would have to live that again. Mike Tyson, once just another boy in Brownsville, now walked with a presence impossible to ignore. Kids followed him, mimicking his stance, whispering his name. Elders nodded with respect. Some warned him to be careful, but all recognized the fire inside him. One afternoon, a neighbor asked, "Mike, what are you going to do with those fists of yours?" Mike's eyes darkened with resolve. "I'll use them to make sure nobody ever puts hands on my mom again, on any of us." It wasn't the boast of a street fighter, it was the promise of a warrior in the making. Raymond Doyle's world collapsed quietly but completely. Stripped of his badge, under investigation for perjury, his name dragged through papers, he walked the streets no longer feared but avoided. Neighbors who once crossed the road in his presence now looked through him like air. At night he drank alone, replaying the moment again and again, the fist, the fall, the courtroom silence when the video played. His power had evaporated, his career reduced to ashes. Turner, once his loyal partner, kept his distance. "You were the author of your own ruin," he told Doyle once coldly before turning away for good. Doyle had no reply. For Anthony Reed, the Tyson case became more than a victory. It became a calling card. His phone never stopped ringing, families asking for help, reporters requesting interviews, churches inviting him to speak. But Anthony remained grounded. When a colleague congratulated him, saying, "You've made it big now," Anthony shook his head. This wasn't about making it. This was about making them listen. And he carried Gloria's strength and Mike's fire with him into every case that followed. Brownsville changed too. Where once people whispered about injustice behind closed doors, now they spoke openly. Chants became meetings. Meetings became organizations. Parents taught their children the name Tyson, not just as a fighter, but as a symbol. Graffiti appeared on brick walls. "Justice lives here." Murals rose, paintings of Gloria with her head high, of Mike with his fist clenched, of the words, "Truth wins." The Tyson case became more than history. It became heritage. The video had crossed state lines, carried by television screens into living rooms nationwide. Conversations spread at dinner tables, in classrooms, in precincts. Some called Mike reckless. Others called him a hero, but no one ignored him. Police departments faced questions. Lawmakers drafted bills. Community leaders spoke with louder voices. For once, the silence was broken. The system rattled. Months later, Gloria stood at the window of her apartment, looking out at the block where it all began. Children played basketball where groceries had once spilled across the sidewalk. Life went on. But she knew it was changed forever. She whispered to herself, "That day they thought they could choke us silent. Instead, they woke us." Late at night, Mike sat alone in his room, his fists resting on his knees. He thought about everything: the chokehold, the punch, the trial, the cheers. He thought about the power in his hands, the responsibility it carried, and he whispered, "I'll never fight for nothing, only for something worth it." Those words weren't for the ring yet, but they were the seed. The story of Amboy Street spread far beyond Brooklyn. It became the tale of a mother's dignity, a son's fists, a community's roar, and a system forced to see itself in the mirror. Years later, when the world would chant Mike Tyson's name in arenas, when his fists would terrify opponents and electrify fans, those who remembered Brownsville would nod and say, his first real fight wasn't in the ring. It was on a sidewalk for his mother's breath, and they would be right. Because on that day, under the weight of injustice, a boy swung one punch that would echo forever.